There once was a big-headed kid. Down slippery slopes how he slid. He picked up a bomb with a big psychic palm and killed the big colorful squid. Hey guys, James here, and today I'm super excited to be reviewing Psychonauts 2, the long-awaited sequel to the cult classic action-adventure platformer by Double Fine Productions. As you might be aware, I was a huge fan of the original, so of course I was ecstatic to play Psychonauts 2. And man, I gotta say, it was well worth the wait. Psychonauts 2 improves upon the original game in just about every way and shows just how much Double Fine has grown since their debut. For those who don't know, Psychonauts follows in the footsteps of other collectathon-style 3D platformers like the 3D Mario games, Banjo-Kazooie, or A Hat in Time, but what makes Psychonauts 2 so unique is the extremely creative mental worlds, an assortment of cool psychic abilities, and a huge focus on telling a surprisingly compelling story. Without further ado, let's dive into this review. Psychonauts 2 follows immediately behind the events of the original game and the VR spin-off Rhombus of Ruin. New players aren't left behind though, as they start off with a cute little animation which explains the story of the predecessors. Now if you watch my video on the first Psychonauts, you might recall me mentioning how one of the biggest weaknesses of the original game was the platforming, but I'm happy to say that controlling Raz here feels much better, although maybe not quite on par with some other modern platformers. While not perfect, it definitely feels a lot more streamlined and smoother than the original. You might still run into some weird camera angles and areas you might get stuck in, but overall, the base platforming has been significantly improved. They still have a ton of different collectibles, figments of imagination, emotional baggage, memory vaults, psi cards, and scavenger hunt items all make a return, and they also bring in some new ones such as nuggets of information, which help to rank Raz up, and my personal favorite, Half a Mind, where you need to find both halves in order to give Raz a max health upgrade. Of course, psychic abilities are one of the biggest parts of the game, and they bring back a number of favorites. This includes marksmanship, levitation, telekinesis, pyrokinesis, and clairvoyance. And pretty much all of these abilities become available to you again within the first hour or two of the game. These moves are actually a bit different than the original game though, with some feeling slightly nerfed. For example, instead of using ammo, Psy Blasts now need to be recharged before being able to fire a limited number of shots, so you can't really spam the move like before. Floating with your levitation ball also no longer lasts forever, and thus its use in platforming does feel a bit nerfed. They implemented an upgrade system for your abilities where you can choose which of your abilities you want to improve based on points you earn from ranking up Raz, and these upgrades can also expand the areas you can explore in the game. They also added an interesting pin system, which basically act as modifiers for your moves. I actually like the pin system as it allows you to change up your moves based on how you like to play, but I do wish they allowed you to equip more than 3, as some of the pins are purely cosmetic and this forces you to give up some more useful abilities. 5 might have been a better number, or perhaps having a separate pin section for cosmetic upgrades would have been nice. Unfortunately, that does mean invisibility, shield, and confusion are no longer part of the game. To replace them, and mini spoiler here, they bring in mental connection, time bubble, and mental projection. I thought these were actually all nice additions, and in particular, I liked how each ability had their separate uses in platforming and combat. For example, the mental connection ability allows you to quickly jump between points in the stage and get to harder to reach areas. Meanwhile, in combat, it could be used to pull enemies closer to you so you can lay a smackdown. Speaking of combat, I think the combat has been improved and is actually a lot more difficult than before. Actions feel much more fluid, especially with the addition of a dedicated dodge button, and maybe thanks to the nerfs to some of the psychic abilities, combat does feel far more varied. A huge part of this is also the fact that the roster of enemy types has been greatly expanded. Outside of the usual sensors, they bring in a bunch of unique enemy types, each with different methods of dealing with them. For example, you have Doubts, these slimy globs who try and slow down Raz but are actually weak to fire. You also have Panic Attacks, these extremely fast shadow beings who you need to time warp in order to properly deal with. There are a bunch of new enemy types that they bring in, and I think all of them are well designed thematically and really help to fit the different emotions that characters feel. The varied enemy types does lead to one problem though, where you often need to stop the action or to swap in the appropriate abilities, which can sometimes cut into the pacing, but because enemies tend to spawn in waves, this can often be done just as a new wave is spawning in and you figure out what you actually need to use. Like the original game, I thought the world design was amazing. The overworld this time around is the Psychonauts headquarters, which is full of different colorful characters such as other agents and other kids who are interning for the Psychonauts. Outside of the headquarters, you also have this large outer area which you can explore and discover secrets in. There are plenty of funny interactions to discover all over, and there is also a number of callbacks to the original game as well. The one thing I will say though is I didn't really like the map system they implemented. I like them aesthetically, but it wasn't always the easiest to follow as an actual video game map. Another minor thing I wanted to nitpick was around harvesting Psytanium, the main currency of the game. I just found it really annoying how instead of pulling it into your inventory, it would instead pop the Psytanium out further away, and this just kind of felt unnecessary. Throughout this adventure, you jump into the minds of a variety of different characters, and each of these worlds feels super unique. The design of each world follows a theme, and in particular, I think the highlight has to be this colorful, drug-influenced psychedelic world. I think the actual level design is overall very solid as well. Each world and section you enter has its own unique concepts and objectives to solve, and these can be really fun and wacky. Although at times, I do feel like the structure of these levels tends to be a bit predictable, as they often fit the mold of, do this thing 3 times in order to beat this section. I found this particularly true for the boss fights, and I sort of felt like a lot of the boss fights felt a bit samey at times. I also did feel like that at times, the level design felt a lot more linear, especially if you compare it to levels like the Milkman Conspiracy or Waterloo World. Although I don't necessarily think that's actually a bad thing. This made the levels feel a lot more focused to me. There are still plenty of secret areas to explore, but you generally do follow a set path to get from one section to another, rather than having a sandbox to explore. This does somewhat take away from the collectathon aspects of the game, where in the original game, I felt like you really had to search in some random areas in order to find some of the collectibles, but here, it felt like most of the collectibles were really kind of along the one path you follow. This is remedied in some of the later levels, but again, I actually didn't think this was a problem because ultimately, I feel like Psychonauts is about much more than just collecting every item in a level. I also did feel like the game felt much more platforming focused in general, and some of the puzzle aspects of the game were more on the simple side when compared to the original. Again, that's not necessarily a criticism, but it was something I did notice and wanted to point out. One minor thing I wanted to bring up here was around the automated hint system. In this game, Raz or other characters will often give hints for different puzzles or sections to help you progress. While I'm sure the system could be helpful for some people, I personally found it annoying because it would often trigger way too quickly. For me, when I was playing, I would want to explore areas before triggering the next section, but once the game thinks you're stuck, they'll have Raz blurt out the answer to a puzzle, and honestly, a lot of the puzzles weren't even that hard where I felt like I needed a hint. Still, I thought pretty much every world was a joy to play through and were creative representations of each character's psychology. I also liked how they would use different platforming sections to transition between level areas, including jumping into a 2D mode. One thing to note, which I actually enjoyed, was how the game would sometimes use platforming as a storytelling device, but I do think it's worth noting that some of the levels will feel less like actual levels and more like scenes in a movie. This brings me to the characters and story, and I'm going to try to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. To keep things at a really high level, Raz and the gang find themselves at Psychonauts headquarters as they try to figure out who kidnapped Truman Zanotto, the head of the Psychonauts. They discover that there could be a mole within the organization, and the mole seems to be trying to reincarnate Lord Voldemort, Maligula, a powerful psychic who was thought to have been vanquished years ago. Overall, I love the story and really enjoy the characters, and I think Psychonauts 2 greatly expands the world and lore of the Psychonauts universe. The game still has all the great humor and charm which made the original game so lovable. There were some moments which genuinely made me laugh out loud, and there are a ton of little interactions you might discover in each area. Every character is very unique and distinguishable, although for me personally, I'm not sure that I like the interns as much as I like the kids at camp in the original, although that could just be nostalgia talking. You also get to meet Raz's family, and they are definitely one of the highlights. Similar to the original, I think some of the best characters are those of some of the minds you explore, and as you dive into their psychology and their stories, I think you'll find some very deep sections that discuss mental health and battling with the inner demons of the characters, such as their personal anxieties and addiction. The story here also feels much more connected and intimate, and as a result, I felt like the story here was a lot more powerful and had a lot more to say on the topic of mental health than the original. I honestly wasn't expecting to be so taken by the story. In terms of the technical aspects, I think the graphics in the game are pretty great. The designs of the worlds are great and felt great to explore. The game also just has some really stylish moments, and I loved how they would transition between different rooms and sections. I think all of that combined gives the game a very trippy and almost cinematic feel to it, and it just helped to give the game more personality. With regards to the audio, I think there's a lot of good, but also some stuff I wish they would have done a bit better. In particular, I think the voice acting was great all around, and every voice felt very fitting for the character. I also thought the music was just oozing with personality. It had clear influences from the original game and brings back some old motifs while also building upon them. I did have 2 issues with the audio though. One, I felt like sometimes characters and voice lines would speak over each other, so you might sometimes miss out on some funny moments or story-related speeches. 2, I also felt like I preferred the ability sound effects from the original game. The sound effects of the different abilities here feel a lot weaker. For example, when using your Psychic Fist or Psy Blast in the original, the impact felt super strong. Here though, the ability sound effects felt kinda like toys going pew pew pew. Overall though, I'm really happy to say that I think Psychonauts 2 lived up to the hype, which is something so difficult to pull off with cult classic games like this. I'm really glad they put in all the extra time to get the game to a point where they were happy with it, and I really think the love and dedication really shows. While there are some flaws, I ultimately think Psychonauts 2 does what I think any great video game should, and that's deliver an experience. In my opinion, despite the relatively short runtime, clocking in at under 20 hours to beat the game depending on your skill and dedication to finding all the collectibles, I think the game is well worth $60. I honestly think they just really don't make games like this anymore, and I think Psychonauts 2 is an experience I'm sure that I'll play through again and again in the future. But hey, that's just me. Feel free to let me know down below what you think. Have you tried Psychonauts 2 and what'd you think of it? And if you made it this far, I just want to say I appreciate you checking out the video. If you enjoyed it, please consider hitting that like or subscribe button as it really helps my channel grow and motivates me to make more and better videos. And as usual, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Peace.